There are some moments the wind forgets. But this one, it stayed with me like the last light that clings to a dying fire. It happened at the edge of summer, when the ground was cracked like old bone and the sky hung low with heat. Gideon Calder had just returned from town, boots heavy with dust and heart heavier still. He wasn't looking for trouble that day. He wasn't looking for anyone at all. He found her in the cellar. The door had been left ajar, swinging wrong like a memory you thought you'd locked away. When he opened it with the barrel of his old rifle, it wasn't rot or rats he found. It was a girl barefoot, covered in dirt, crouched between crates like a cornered animal. One hand wrapped around a bruised apple, the other pressed tight to her belly like it might keep her from disappearing. She didn't cry, didn't beg, just looked up with dry eyes that had already seen too much. "I'm not stealing," she whispered. "I just want food." And that was the first thing she gave him truth. No excuses, no drama. Just hunger in its plainest form. Gideon kept the rifle steady for one more breath. Then he lowered it slow. "You're trespassing," he said. She nodded once. "I know." He could have sent her away. Should have, maybe. But something in her face, a kind of stillness that didn't come from peace, but from being too tired to run, made him step back. "Come upstairs," he said. And just like that, the silence of the house changed, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for someone to knock from the inside. She never asked to stay. That first night, Gideon pointed to the barn and handed her a folded blanket worn thin from years and softened by memory. "There's hay in the loft," he said. "Don't spook the horses." She nodded, clutching the blanket like it was a promise. He didn't sleep much. Just sat on the porch, a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hands, watching the sliver of light from the barn window, waiting for it to move. But it never did. She didn't run. She didn't sneak. She just slept, if you could call that kind of stillness sleep. The next morning, she was already up barefoot again, standing near the chicken coop, like she wasn't sure if the birds would attack or welcome her. Her face was pale under the rising sun, her braid a mess of dust and loose strands. She didn't see him at first. But when she did, she lifted a hand in a quiet wave, not eager, not grateful, just acknowledgement. Like someone who'd learned long ago not to expect kindness, but still chose to name it when it came. She placed a basket of eggs on the porch steps, then turned and went back to the coop. For 3 days, she barely spoke. She swept the porch though her hands were blistered. She chopped kindling though her aim was crooked. She mended a torn feed sack with thread from a button jar. Every motion was careful quiet, like she was trying to stitch herself into the rhythm of the place without drawing attention. Gideon didn't ask questions, but he noticed. The way she paused every time she reached for food, like she expected someone to snatch it away. The way she flinched, not from noise, but from silence that stretched too long. The way she kept looking at the swing on the porch, like she could still hear it creak under someone else's memory. On the 4th morning, she hummed. Just a whisper of sound, a broken tune with no real melody, while she swept dust off the steps. Gideon paused in the doorway. She didn't stop. Maybe she didn't even know she was doing it. But that sound, faint and fragile, felt louder than thunder. That night, he left a second blanket folded near the hearth. The next morning it was gone. Saturday came, and Gideon rode into town for supplies. When he returned, she wasn't in the barn or the garden. He found her sitting on the porch steps, arms wrapped around her knees. The wind had picked up, dragging the smell of pine sap and distant smoke down from the hills. "They buried them yesterday," she said, not looking at him. Some preacher said a few words. Then they walked off. He didn't speak. Just lowered himself beside her, the porch creaking beneath his weight. "I wanted to stay," she said, voice smaller than before. But the sheriff said I couldn't live in the woods alone. Said someone had come get me. She turned her head slightly. No one did. Gideon stared out over the land. He'd buried people here too quietly without ceremony. Some folks deserved better than what the world gave them. How far did you walk, he asked. 2 days, she said. No shoes. He glanced down. Her feet were scraped and raw. She saw his eyes linger and shrugged. Didn't feel it much. Another silence came, but this one didn't ache like the others. It settled like dust in sunlight. What was your mother like, he asked. She hesitated. Soft hands, even when she was mad. He nodded. Mine too. She looked at him then. You still got yours? He shook his head slowly. Wife, long gone. She didn't say sorry, just nodded like she understood the kind of loss that doesn't want to be pitied. Does it get easier, she asked. No, he said, staring out across the dry field. But it gets quieter. She let out a breath that trembled, then steadied. And when she stood, her legs were less shaky. I'll finish the eggs. He watched her go. And for the first time in years, something inside him shifted, not fast, not loud, but like a seed, remembering how to sprout after a long, cruel frost. That evening, when he went out to the barn, he found a biscuit on his workbench, still warm, wrapped in a piece of cloth. He didn't mention it. But the next morning, he set 2 plates on the table. And this time, she sat down without asking. The first time he brought her into town, Gideon said only one thing. Don't look at anyone longer than you have to, and don't answer what they don't deserve to ask. Clara didn't say a word. Just tied her braid with a strip of yellow cloth she'd found in the laundry weeks before. It was faded and frayed, but she wore it like it meant something. Maybe it did. She rode behind him, arms lightly around his waist, the rhythm of the horse like a memory her body hadn't lived yet. When they crested the hill, the town of Ashridge spread below, like something half awake. One main road, sagging hitching posts, crooked signs. A town that looked like it forgot how to welcome and just remembered how to watch. And they watched. Old men on porch chairs, women with mouths like sewing needles. Kids too young to know shame, but old enough to feel it. Clara kept her eyes low, her hands still, her back straight. At the general store, Gideon handed her a folded piece of paper and a $1 bill. Flour, sugar, nails. If anyone says anything, he started. I won't answer, she finished. He gave a small nod and turned toward the merchant. Inside, Clara moved like a whisper through the aisles. Every step deliberate, every choice careful, as if the wrong item might get her accused of something worse than theft. Near the pickle barrel stood Beatrice Crowley, the widow with lips always too tight and perfume too sweet. She leaned over to the clerk and murmured just loud enough to be heard, "Isn't that Gideon Calder's stray?" Another voice hissed from behind the molasses tins, "She looks half savage, doesn't she?" Clara didn't flinch. Her spine stayed straight, her eyes fixed on the paper in her hands, like it was scripture. When she placed the items on the counter, the clerk paused. "You got coin?" She handed him the $1. He counted it twice, slow and suspicious, then stuffed it into the till without a thank you. Just bagged the supplies, every fold of the paper bag, sounding like judgment. That's when Jeb Myers walked in. He was 19 but carried himself like someone owed the whole world. Hat tipped back, boots too clean for real work. He sauntered toward the counter, grin already curling. "Well, if it ain't the barn girl," he said. Clara said nothing. Blackwell talking in strays now. He spit a brown streak into the corner. You eaten off his floor or his bed. She didn't react, didn't even blink. But the paper bag in her hands split down the side. Flowers spilled across the floor like white smoke. She dropped to her knees, gathering it with trembling fingers. Jeb laughed, cruel and full of himself. Then the door creaked. Gideon stood there. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't even touch the rifle slung on his back. Just stared at Jeb like frost forming on glass. "You break my fence again, boy," he said evenly. "You'll be paying with your horse." Jeb looked like he wanted to say something more, but thought better of it. He backed away sneering, but didn't stay. Gideon stepped beside Clara, crouched to her level, and said, "Get the rest." They walked out side by side. Neither said a word. But something passed between them, quiet, invisible, stronger than 100 speeches. That evening, Clara didn't speak for hours. She scrubbed the porch until her knuckles were raw, her dress damp with sweat and soap. Gideon passed her on his way to the barn. She didn't look up. "I didn't cry," she muttered. "You had to," he said. She straightened, eyes flashing. "Doesn't matter how I act. They already decided what I am." He sat on the steps beside her. The wood warm beneath them, the sun just beginning to dip low. Horses shifted in the distance. A hawk circled high overhead. "So decide who you are first," he said. "Then make them wrong." Clara turned to look at him. Really look. Like she was seeing him not as the man who offered her shelter, but as someone who'd been breaking and rebuilding in silence long before she came. "That easy?" she asked, her voice like glass warmed by fire. "No," he said, shaking his head slowly, "but it's yours to do." She didn't answer right away. Just nodded, the motion slow and uncertain, like she was trying the idea on from the inside. Later that night, after supper, Gideon heard the sound of a brush moving across wood. He peeked out the kitchen window. There she was, painting the front of the barn with a bucket of thick red paint she must have dragged from the shed. The color was faded, nearly dried, but she worked anyway, arm rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She didn't stop when it got dark. He brought her a glass of water and left it on the step. She didn't drink it right away. Just sat beside it, holding the coolness in her palms, like proof. Proof that she was still here, still trying, still unbroken. They didn't speak much that next week. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was something else now. Something settled, like dirt packed over seeds. Clara began tending the forgotten garden behind the barn. No one told her to. She just knelt down one morning beside the old rose, dead and cracked like a mouth too long shut, and started pulling weeds with blistered fingers. Gideon watched from the porch. He didn't offer help, didn't ask why. She didn't speak until her shadow crossed the porch steps at sundown. "Was this hers?" she asked, brushing dirt from her knees. Gideon didn't need to ask who she meant. His eyes drifted toward the rusted spade, still half buried in the earth. "Eliza's," he said. She tried to keep it going, gave up near the end. Clara looked back at the garden. The soil was dry, stubborn. "She'd die mad at you." His jaw tensed. "No, she died loving me more than I earned." Clara sat down beside the stairs, silent for a long moment. Then she whispered, "I think maybe love's like planting. You don't always know what'll take, but you try anyway." He didn't respond. Just reached for the lantern and lit it, watching the way the flame bent toward her without flickering. That night, she brought in a bundle of wild chamomile and laid it gently on the kitchen table. "It's good for sleeping," she said, "for nerves." Gideon picked up one of the sprigs, turned it in his fingers, then tucked it behind his ear. She smiled. The kind of smile you don't give the world, only people who've let you stay. But the next morning, the wind had changed. Gideon stepped out to feed the horses and noticed something fluttering on the barn door. A slip of paper pinned with a nail. No name. Just 2 words scrawled in a hand that tried to be tidy but failed. "Keeper." He stared at it for a long time, the wind tugging at the corners. He didn't need to guess where it came from. The same voices that had hissed in the store, spat on the ground as she passed, now wrote what they didn't have the courage to say aloud. When he turned, Clara was standing behind him. She must have seen his face, or maybe she felt the storm that hadn't broken yet. "You said it didn't matter," she said softly. "But it does." He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally said, "You belong here." She didn't answer, just walked back into the house, the screen door creaking shut behind her like a breath held too long. That day, neither of them worked. The land seemed to know something had cracked. Even the crows stayed quiet. That evening, she stood in front of the mirror Gideon had never taken down. It was crooked, the frame chipped at the edges. She ran her hand down the faded hem of her dress. It was too short now. Her wrists and ankles had outgrown it, but she pulled at the sleeves anyway, trying not to look at her own eyes too long. There were things in them she wasn't ready to name. From the porch, his voice came low and even. "We ride at 10. She didn't ask where, just listened. That was where she lived now, in the space between what people said and what they meant. He meant trust. He just didn't know how to say it. Next morning, she stepped outside with a yellow kerchief tied tight around her braid. Gideon handed her a satchel, the old leather one Eliza used for herbs, and said, "You'll want that. Dust'll kick up." They rode into town side by side. No words, just rhythm. The town hadn't softened. Faces still stared too long. Doors still whispered behind them. But Clara sat straighter in the saddle now. Her hands didn't shake when she dismounted. She walked into the store alone. Inside, everything felt louder than before. The tick of the clock, the shuffle of boots, the slow, deliberate insult that hung in the air before it was even spoken. Jeb was already there, leaning against the counter like rot disguised as charm. "You earning coin now," he sneered. "We're still trading stories behind the barn." Clara didn't even look at him. Just placed her items, lamp oil, a sack of sugar, a packet of clothespins onto the counter. Calm, measured, as if she were placing bricks to build something new. But when the clerk took her coin, Jeb stepped forward and grabbed her wrist. "Hey now," he said, "too close. I asked you a question." The bag slipped. Lamp oil burst across the floor, sugar scattered like spilled salt. The room froze. Beatrice Crowley lit her cigarette without blinking. "Sheriff's out back," she said. "I'll fetch him." But Clara didn't move, not an inch. She said quiet but clear, "Let go." Jeb didn't. So she leaned in, eyes steady, voice low. "My father taught me how to gut a deer in under 5 minutes. You think I don't know how to use a knife on something smaller?" He blinked. Then he let go. Clara crouched, picked up the sugar, gathered the oil, and looked the clerk in the eye. "I'll come back with coin for the rest," she said. "Or not. Don't matter." She walked out. Didn't slam the door. Didn't run. But the sound that followed her was louder than any closing gavel. By the time Clara reached the ridge, the clouds had thickened like bruises over the hills. The air had that heavy, watchful feel, like the earth itself was waiting to exhale. Gideon was already standing outside the barn, one hand on the gate, the other resting on his hip. He didn't ask what had happened. Didn't have to. The hem of her dress was soaked with spilled oil, her hands trembling just enough to give it away. She handed him the bag, lamp oil-recovered sugar now packed in a second sack. "Didn't get the clothespins," she said. He took the bag without looking inside. "You all right?" She sat down on the porch steps and began pulling off her boots. "I wanted them to say something worse," she said flatly. "Something I could fight." He eased down beside her, boots creaking under his weight. The sky grumbled above them, thunder not loud yet, but close. "You want to fight?" he said. "You'll get one. This town don't back down, even when it's wrong." She didn't answer right away, just stared out toward the garden where her wildflowers were bending under the wind. "You ever wonder if this place is cursed? Sometimes. Think you'd ever leave it?" He took a long breath. I buried her here. I know. The storm broke just after sundown. Not all at once, but in layers, wine first pushing dust across the yard, then rain in big stubborn drops that hit the ground like questions that had waited too long for answers. When the barn door slammed hard enough to rattle the rafters, Gideon was the first to move. Clara followed, lantern in hand, her braid already soaked down her spine. Inside, the horses kicked against the stalls, nerves sparking wild from the thunder. Gideon laid a hand on the mare's flank, whispering something low and steady. Clara moved to the far end of the barn, where the younger colt was shivering in the corner, eyes wide and whites showing. Then a crack wood splitting high above sent both of them flinching. Rain poured in through a new seam in the roof, slashing across the hay. "Get the tarp," Gideon barked. She dashed to the shelves, found the canvas folded beneath old saddle blankets. Together, they climbed and reached and nailed and braced the storm screaming around them like a thing alive. Her hands bled from splinters, his back strained with every swing of the hammer. But they didn't stop. When it was done, they collapsed against the stable wall, soaked through and panting like the barn itself had exhaled relief. Gideon glanced at her. Her braid had come undone. Her hands were trembling, but not from fear. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, teeth chattering faintly, just wet. He let out a small chuckle. "Aren't we all?" They sat in silence for a long time, the kind that doesn't need filling. Then softly she said, "I never told anyone. Not the sheriff. Not even when they asked." He looked at her. Rain still hissed across the roof, but inside the barn it felt oddly still. "My father," she said, "he didn't die in his sleep. He took the rope down from our porch. After Mama passed, I found him swinging." Gideon didn't move. "I cut him down," she said, "with my hands. Tore them raw. There was no one else. I dug the hole behind the house. The preacher came later, but by then he was already in the ground." Her voice didn't shake, but her fingers twitched like they remembered what her mind had tried to forget. "I don't tell it for pity," she added. I needed someone to know." Gideon reached over and took her hands. Not to comfort, to understand. He turned them over gently in the lantern light, seeing the faint scars cross her palms like a map made in pain. "You can't carry that by yourself," he said. "I did? You don't have to anymore." She looked at him. Really looked. Like someone standing at the edge of a cold river, not sure if the water would welcome her or swallow her whole. "I don't know how to let someone help," she whispered. "You don't start by knowing," he said. "You start by staying." Lightning split the sky just then, long and white, casting their shadows against the far wall of the barn. Two figures close, but separate, stitched into the same frame. Later, after the storm calmed to a whisper, Clara lay curled on the old hay mattress, breathing slow and steady. Gideon sat nearby, a book unopened in his lap, listening to the drip-drip of water still leaking through the patched roof. But then he saw something outside, a flicker of motion just beyond the fence line. A pale horse, a rider still as stone watching the house from the trees, then turning, vanishing into the night, like a warning unfinished. He didn't wake her, but he didn't sleep either, because storms weren't always made of rain, and some riders didn't come for words. The morning after the storm, the world felt rinsed. The ground wasn't muddy, just soft, like it had remembered how to forgive something. Clara stepped onto the porch barefoot, her dress hem brushing the damp wood. She stood there a moment, just breathing. The sky above was still heavy with cloud, but no longer angry. More like thoughtful. Down by the fence line, Gideon was already at work, hammering a broken rail back into place. She watched him in silence for a while. Then, without a word, picked up the second hammer leaning against the steps and walked out to join him. They didn't talk. Didn't need to. That was the rhythm they'd found work as conversation gestures stitched from quiet. When the final nail was set, Clara looked toward the patch of soil beside the barn where her wildflowers had begun to bloom. Small things. Crooked, but living. I think they're going to take, she said. Gideon nodded. So do I. But peace doesn't last long in places that aren't built for it. By noon, the first rider came. Beatrice Crowley's shawl tied tight under her chin. Lips pursed like she was biting back a sermon. She dismounted stiffly, tied her reins with more force than necessary, and walked straight toward the porch. I hear you've been letting the girls speak for you, she said to Gideon. He stood up slow, wiping his hands on a cloth. She speaks for herself. Beatrice's gaze slid toward Clara, who stood near the barn door, hands dusty braid wind-tossed. You're not owed anything here, girl. Clara didn't flinch. She tilted her chin slightly. I'm not asking. Gideon stepped forward, placing himself between them. You can turn around now, Beatrice. Her eyes narrowed. The town's not going to buy from you much longer. You make your choice. I already did. She left without another word, but her silence rang louder than any gossip ever could. That afternoon, a second rider came hard over the ridge, mud spattered and breathless. Sheriff Zeke. He didn't even dismount, just shouted before the horse had stopped moving. There's been a bite. Snake Crowley, it's bad. Clara was already moving before Gideon could ask. What happened? Copperhead, behind the shed. They can't stop the swelling. Gideon met her eyes. You know what you need. I know enough. She grabbed her satchel, the same one he'd given her the day of the storm, and began collecting herbs from the garden, some dried, some still green with morning dew. Goldenrod, crushed pine, sage from the hill behind the barn. I'll ride with you, Gideon said. They galloped down the ridge with the wind pushing at their backs like it wanted them there. When they arrived, Snake was lying on a cot, pale and sweat-drenched, his leg swollen and purple. Beatrice was pacing hands, wringing face drawn with a fear she didn't know how to hide. Clara knelt beside the boy without waiting for permission. I need space, she said, and boiled water. Beatrice hesitated, pride fighting panic, then finally nodded. Kitchen's through there. The room filled with the sharp scent of herbs and the softer sounds of care. Clara moved with certainty, her voice low and calm, as she packed poultices. Wrapped cloth cooled the fever. Her hands, those same scarred, blistered hands, were steady as anything Gideon had ever seen. Hours passed. The swelling slowed. The boy's breathing evened. When Clara finally stood, her knees popped, but her voice didn't shake. He'll live, she said. Beatrice stared at her like she didn't know whether to kneel or run. Gideon placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. Let's go home. They rode back in silence. The next morning, a sack of flour appeared on the porch. No note, no knock. Later came a bundle of eggs, a tin of nails, a folded length of cloth. Quiet apologies disguised as gifts. Clara unpacked them one by one, laying them on the table with careful hands. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, just said almost to herself, is this what forgiveness looks like? Gideon poured 2 mugs of coffee. Looks like seeds, he said. You don't know what'll grow yet. That evening, Clara asked to ride out to the cabin near the creek, the one that hadn't been lived in since Eliza passed. He went with her. The door still squeaked. Dust clung to every beam. But it was intact, waiting. Clara stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. It smells like memory. Gideon stepped into the doorway, holding something wrapped in cloth. He offered it to her. You said you didn't know where you belonged. I thought maybe. This could be yours. She unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a key. I haven't earned this, she said. You earned it the moment you stopped running. She looked at him, eyes full and quiet. You sure? He nodded. That cabin's been waiting for something worth keeping. She walked out onto the porch, sat on the top step, and looked out toward the creek. The water moved, steady and soft, like breath that had finally settled. "Do you miss her every day?" she asked. Gideon stared into the trees. "Not every day. Some days I just feel her in the wind, like she's still waiting for me to get it right." Clara leaned against the post. "I'm not her." "I know," he said. "You're you. That's enough." She closed her eyes. And somewhere in the tall grass beyond the fence line, a single wildflower bloomed. The cabin was quiet that morning. No wind, no birdsong, just the hush of a place waiting to be lived in again. Clara opened the shutters and let the light in. It fell in soft gold across the floor, catching on dust motes that spun like memory. Her boots thudded gently across the wood as she moved from corner to corner, cleaning, placing, tending. Nothing grand, nothing quick, just making it hers. Behind the cabin, she planted the first row of onions, same patch where Eliza once tried. The soil was stubborn, but she dug anyway, hands in the dirt like roots that had waited long enough. The garden didn't ask where she came from. Didn't care what the town whispered. It just accepted. That afternoon, she rode back up to the ranch to borrow a kettle. Gideon met her at the gate, holding it out like he already knew. "Water still boils the same," he said, smiling faintly. "And some things grow back," she replied. They stood like that for a long while, no hurry, no need. Just two people learning how to stay. Before she turned to go, Clara looked back at the land behind her. Dusty, worn, but blooming in places that had been dead for years. Not much, but enough.